All right. Hi, I'm Victoria Johnson. I'm not just your moderator, I'm also a presenter. We're running a little bit behind, but I'll keep us on time. I have 50 slides, but my presentation style is sort of like my approach to life, that of a t-shirt cannon, so we're gonna keep it pretty fast. In real life, I'm a Geographic Information Officer with McFadden, supporting USAID's Office of Transition Initiatives, and this talk is not about that at all. Someday I'll talk about my work, not today. This is about a fun side project I did instead. So this is Lafayette, and it's not entirely my creation. I mean, the map is, but that's why I'm here. The concept and the extensive world building behind it belongs to my friend and collaborator on this project, Stephen Nordine, who is running a D&D type role-playing game in this environment and just thought it might be fun to have a map. And as for the why, he's kindly provided a more in-depth explainer in his own words to accompany this map in the map gallery. It's on wall 3D. But the gist is, it's a real unreal state. It's a place that takes into account everything that already exists in a real time and place, the 1920s American South, and twists it a little bit towards the eldritch. The players are in a place hewn closer to the real world, and they have to deal with the realities of that time period, but also monsters. So while he was responsible for the social geography, I handled the physical geography, the lay of the land. And the concept is fairly simple. What if the Yucatan Peninsula was its own tectonic plate, and what if 400-some million years ago, that tectonic plate smashed into the North American plate along the Florida Gulf Coast? And I know that's not exactly how plate tectonics works, but that's the beauty of speculative fiction cartography. You can just hand wave away a lot. The first step was assembling the landmass, which looks something like this. It should be pretty obvious that I did not use the Yucatan for this. I did on my first pass. This is an early look, a big yikes, from when I was messing around in Blender very early on, but I required mountains. And why make mountains out of molehills when you can make mountains out of mountains? I scoured the rest of the planet for a piece of land that had the right kind of coastline, flatlands, and some kind of big but not too big mountains in a relatively small area. So, free drink ticket on the line. Do you recognize what landmass I used here? This is the version before I smoothed out the gradient, so it's pretty clear what terrain was just slapped on top of Florida. For a hint, north is a societal construct. Anyone? Sicily, that's right. You get a drink ticket. After realizing the Yucatan wouldn't work for what I wanted, I actually started with the Cascade Range north of the Columbia River, right here in Washington State, but that didn't feel right. I tried a compressed and rotated New Zealand South Island, which is shown here, also not right. The Great Northern Peninsula of Newfoundland, a pretty wide selection of alternate terrain from all over the planet. And I regret that I didn't take any more progress shots because they're all disasters, like this one before I made the call on Sicily. And this is just kind of a window into the Victoria Johnson file naming standards. One of these worked, and I had to go through like multiple times to get to the one that worked, which I believe was Scream. So the terrain is shuttle radar topography mission, SRTM, data that I just played with in Photoshop until it looked okay. My colleague Katie Perry, she gave a talk on PCD as well, gave me a tutorial on this process a few months ago, and I love it. I swear I've gotten better on it. I use it a lot at work, but this is kind of my first stab at it, and I had a lot of fun figuring out the gradient. I'm not going to go too much into that because this isn't Practical Cartography Day, and what I'm doing here is not practical cartography. If you look closely at this version, it doesn't make a ton of sense, so let's move on. A finished map contains a vast amount of detailed information, and my collaborator gave me a few pages of deeply researched and richly imagined world-building details, and I built the landscape around them. I kept most of the state borders intact, assuming the various treaties and agreements behind them also intact, and made the fictional Katy River the border between Florida and Lafayette. Katy, like its range to the west, is taken from the Muskogee term for red. The toponymy of the state is sourced from a real hot mix of Muskogee landform and like physical item terms, and a list of mid-level bureaucrats from 19th century Louisiana state politics. It works though, right? So the first thing I did when presented with this task was to look at maps from the 1920s, and I quickly realized when researching this project that there is not a singular defined cartographic style of 1928. And that's kind of like saying, you know, of course, there isn't a standard cartographic style for 2019. I mean, look around the map gallery. Cartography is and always has been necessarily all over the place. And as cartographers, we really have to be cognizant of how our products will be read and interacted with by a given user. Here, my users really just needed the basics. This is not a map for detailed point-to-point navigation. It's really just the essential locations provided by my collaborator as necessary locations for his group's quest, plus a few other details that I added at my own discretion to more fully flesh it out. The more general approach allowed me to be able to pick and choose certain aspects from a lot of different kinds of maps from all over the place without feeling the need to adhere to reproducing one particular vision. Yesterday at Practical Cartography Day, Madison Draper and Dana Sewell of Mapbox talked about having a statement of intent for a map. So I guess in my head, my map hangs in an office at the Lafayette Geographic Bureau in the state capital of Beauvais, maybe at a visitor's center, tourist points, used as a background for sort of documentation and things. An early idea for this map, though, was a motor touring map as the quest group is moving around, with the main map kind of surrounded by ads for businesses around the state, very cutesy. And there were touring maps like that produced around the 1920s. This is one produced by an oil company in 1929. But they provide a level of road detail that overwhelms every other feature. And that really didn't do for what I was going for. Plus the sort of like roadside motel, drive-in, that sort of culture that I could build the ads around didn't really get going until post-World War II, and that did not fit my time frame. But I cast a wide net for general influences at first, and I had a few names or topics in mind that I went to immediately, chief among them Lucien Boucher, a French designer best known, at least to me, for his indelible Air France airline route map posters. This is one that he did for Air France in 1939, but before he was flying high with Air France, he was just a working artist and provided a series of 4 pictorial maps for a 1927 book called The Transatlantic from Christopher Columbus to Charles A. Lindbergh by Pierre Weiss. And he also provided this art, I believe, from the title page, which just if you're looking for a synth pop album cover, go with it, it's great. I want to talk about 2 of the 4 maps he did in particular. First, this map of General Pershing, June 1917, from which I 100% ripped off the color scheme. This shade of teal that can't hold its lunch it's appeared a few times on maps that I found, and there's a really kind of spooky, foggy, unsettling quality to it, like the sea a night before a storm. And I guess what I'm saying is I want you to look at my work and feel sick. The land, beige is less evocative, but it does look very good with the green. And the second map from the book I want to highlight was drawn to accompany writing about the Marquis de Lafayette, which, while imitating historical cartographic styles himself, Boucher has basically drawn Lafayette up there. Like, that's basically what it's shaped like. He also drew this incredible map monster. I love her so much. So while Boucher had a lot of freedom, for my kinds of map, there were specific ways that cartographers back then and today would have been expected to do things, like the Lafayette Geographic Bureau would have had its own design standards for maps. And one thing I found that I relied upon pretty heavily was a 1920s USGS standards manual, the preparation of illustrations for reports of the United States Geological Survey by John L. Ridgway, which is available via Project Gutenberg. And like Michael McNeil said yesterday, it's important to document your standards, not just so you can use them, so lazy cartographers can rip them off a century later. The standards manual covers a lot of the sort of small ephemera that the cartographer never really has to think too hard about on an individual map, because the standards guide has already done it. That's the beauty of a standards guide. The decision has already been made. For example, the abbreviations for the states. The powers that be at the USGS in 1920, I really like to imagine that they had a meeting about this. I really like to imagine like a group of people around a table just getting really heated about making these decisions. Like, why do some get, Georgia is GA, but Nebraska gets 4 letters, Wisconsin gets 3. I don't know, I'd like to think a table was flipped about this. That's just kind of how I envision meetings. We've all been in meetings where the, utter minutia just becomes so tense. I was able to refer to this guide for things like that, so Mississippi and Alabama are abbreviated appropriately according to USGS standards at the time. And I used it for like road markings, things like that. And there are 2 particular features I want to talk about on the map. The mountains and the swamp. Mountains, there are a lot of ways to show mountains. We've seen a bunch so far already this week. One popular method is this sort of outsized cartoony style. Here on a 1928 map, of the world of books, and a closer look at the kind of representation I'm talking about, with big mountains standing in for a lot of small ones. It's sort of a cartographic metonymy. Hill shading always has a big place in a cartographer's heart. Again, here's a closer look at it's a 1926 US geodetic survey map of the Bay Area. Sometimes a combination of the two. Here on the Summerland Beautiful, a promotional rail map from 1926. But like I said, I could pick and choose. And after having gone through all of that trouble to make the terrain in Photoshop, I went for kind of a muted take on that, which shows relief with just a gray shape. This is a British military map of Japan from 1925, and a closer look. Some parts of it look like a stain on like the ceiling of an elementary school all-purpose room, but it's really just a distinct outline of where there is relief. It's like the light is coming from straight up. And if you get really close, the lines are all very tiny hatchers and dots. Moment of silence for the eyes of those cartographers that had to draw all those teensy tiny little lines. So I just muted the terrain a lot to get a similar effect. I don't know if you can see it on this thing. I may have muted it too much. Might kind of look like there's just something printed on the other side of the page, I don't know. The swamp, the Bayou Paradis, I'm forever butchering the name of anything French, my apologies. It makes up a good like 15% of the state, and it's meant to be a pretty wild, uninhabited area, like the Everglades, but broader and deeper. This is a remote and treacherous area. You can kind of imagine the roads that pass through the bayou wiped out by a hurricane, blocked by a troop of gators demanding you answer a riddle. Lots of reasons why these roads might be impassable. But an interesting thing about showing a swamp on a map is there are so many different ways to show a swamp, and they're all very clearly swamps. This is not one of them. Bear with me for a second. Irwin Race was an active cartographer around this time. You may know of him more for his hand-inked landform maps. This is one from the 1940s showing the area where we are right now. It's lovely. And in 1931, he published an article on his methods in the Geographical Review saying, "There's one problem in cartography that has not yet been solved: the depiction of the scenery of large areas on small-scale maps." And I disagree. One, I think he was doing a fine job depicting that, but also the one problem that hasn't been solved. So, I mean, here's his Olympic Peninsula again to illustrate that, like, yes, you can do it. But I get what he means. It's difficult to convey this sort of thing in a way that's accurate to reality, but still appealing. And this is his own style from the same article, depicting swamps. It looks pretty swampy. Tidal marsh, similarly, pretty good, looks swampy. The USGS manual I referenced earlier also has an option for swamps, but so did this Latvian design manual from the same time period I found at makingmaps.net. The race stuff is also from makingmaps.net. If Laris is here, he might be able to read this properly, but according to Google Translate, it's Marks for Maritime Plans, produced by Latvia's Department of Agriculture in Riga in 1928. In Latvia, I did not realize that the country was so heavy on the swamps, but they really got into the weeds depicting very nuanced types of swamps. I mean, these are not all swamps. You can see the upper corners are parkland, and like there's some quarries in there as well. But many of them are moss bogs, peat bogs, marshlands, swamps, fens, which I only learned while doing this, that a fen is a low and marshy, frequently flooded area of land, which does sound like a swamp. This is the one that I've circled up here is the proper swamp, and that's the one that I like the best. It's similar enough to the Rays and USGS swamps, in that it uses parallel lines with cute little tufts. So I combined the general look with the light green from the Latvian manual to make these, and I pitched them at a slight angle entirely by accident. It was a cat on the keyboard situation, but I liked it. It adds a subtle, unsettling feeling to the map. And also, another thing on the map, I guess, I saw a lot of very frilly and scrolly sort of classic cartouches. But the look that I chose was a take on the cartouche here on this map of Poinciana Island. It's simple but elegant, and it allows me to add another little like eldritch touch with the tentacles without really overwhelming the whole thing with a lot of scrolls and fine details that didn't really fit in with the rest of the project. It's a similar color scheme as well. Semi-relevant sidebar. This is a different kind of speculative fiction cartography. It's speculative real estate cartography. I couldn't find a lot of information about this one. But this map of Poinciana Island was apparently the creation of a guy named B. Ashburton Tripp in 1925, and the development itself never saw the light of day beyond the map. The entire island was obliterated in the Great Hurricane of 1926, but the map was included in an art show in Cleveland, so good for B. Ashburton Tripp. It was apparently located near the Everglades at the mouth of the appropriately named Lostman River. And sidebar to the sidebar, look at this locator map. This is another case of knowing your particular audience, I guess, because that helps me figure out where this is supposed to be. Not at all. Sidebar to the sidebar to the sidebar. I was looking for more information about this, and I'm not sure. It might just be full-on speculative fiction. I couldn't find much beyond what was in the David Rumsey Map Library, but there are a lot of condos and yacht clubs and things that bear the same name today, which, I don't know, if this was real, that seems like a bad omen. So, there's a lot of failures in cartographic experimentation, at least there are the way I do it, and aside from the fact that I made this on a computer, there's one major area where I took a departure from my stated goal of reproducing cartographic styles of the 1920s, and that's the lettering. Typefaces introduced in the 1920s include Urbar Grotesque, Colonna, Futura, Gil Sans, my favorite, Cooper Black. And I ended up using a type family created in 2013 by a designer, Laura Worthington, called Charcuterie, that I felt really just worked well with this project. It's got this incredibly appealing hint of rough edges that give a sense of hand lettering, which is maybe hard to see in the back of the room, which is why I put failure in 200-point font. Heather Smith of Esri earlier had a very creative way of down and up sampling DPI to create this effect. But I felt the charming irregularities of Charcuterie really fit with the theme because many of these maps were not done with typefaces, although that was becoming increasingly available as an option. Lots of maps were hand-lettered, often with a stencil guide like the ones shown here, and this image is from History of Cartography, which was edited by previous presenter Mark. It's an incredible resource. The stencil guide would have either have the full letter or dots, the full letter there and dots on the other side, that the cartographer or letterer would mark very carefully with the writing implement. It's fascinating stuff, and I'm so glad I didn't have to do it. In closing, I know it's 5:20, we want to get out of here. In closing, I do want to take a moment to reflect on NACIS itself and what I've learned here. This is the first time I've shared something I made anywhere for any reason. And through the entire process, I really found myself reflecting back on previous talks given by and to this community. And I wanted to highlight some of them here because I've learned so much from being a member of the North American Cartographic Information Society. And I've been able to apply what I've learned here in so many different ways. These are just some of the works and talks that were on my mind while working on this specific project. I've used so many more at work and on other projects, often in very surprising to me ways, and that's not to mention the innumerable imperceptible shifts in my own biases and approach, and just ways of thinking about cartography. And I just wanted to acknowledge the information, the learning, and the experiences shared here in this community of practice are important and lasting, and I very much appreciate them. If someone wants to give a talk on slide layout, I could use it though. All right, that's it. We're out of time. If you have any questions, I look like this. I have a bi-weekly Fun with Maps newsletter that has thus far proven to be not consistently any of those things, bi-weekly fun or about maps. But if you are interested in an irregular mid-level dive into truly tedious subject matter, sign the heck up. I love it. Thank you again. And thank you to John, MJ, Neil, and Mark for making this a fantastic session on cartographic history.